Okay, evening everybody. First things first, do I take it by reason of your presence here now that everybody has made decisions and is taking this course? Okay, well, welcome, and I'm sure you won't regret your decision. So a couple of preliminaries really, nothing very much. I've been trying, I mentioned that Discover the Course comfortably does normally require some additional classes. I have been trying to get clarity on what works in terms of my own availability and potential substantial numbers of classes on the time frame, which obviously I'm trying to avoid as much as possible. I hope I will be able to post a message on Keats this week confirming the timetable only as far as this term. I mean, one of the things I'd like to do is see how quickly we're going and how many we're going to need next. But what I would rather, on the basis it's better to be ahead than fall behind, that the worst that could happen next time is that we get slightly ahead of ourselves. What I'm proposing to do is to put on 3 additional classes this term, and in addition, as I've already flagged up, I'm unavoidably overseas on business on quite a way off, Tuesday the 20th of November, so that class would have to be rescheduled. So there'll be one class knocked out on the Tuesday the 20th of November, and therefore effectively 4 other classes that will be timetabled, and I will let you know as soon as possible. We're in week 3 now. It is my intention that the first one of those be in week 5, so do look out for my notifications to that effect. Secondly, I hope you will, as kindly join me by turning off phones for the duration of this and all future classes. It's not nice for you, and it's not nice for me to have to stare people out who haven't done so. Believe me, from this side of the fence, it is quite distracting. I just rather we will have complete engagement. So I hope that is okay. I don't think I've got any other rules. You're going to be relieved today. Thirdly, how are people getting on in terms of getting a Heartbeat book? Have most people got it? Okay. You will need it today. So if either you or someone kindly sitting next to you on either side does not have a copy, it would be prudent to rearrange yourself now next to somebody who does. So can I just allow a moment for anybody who doesn't have sight of a copy to just move around if necessary? Is there anybody? Obviously, I quite understand that not everybody may have got it yet, but you obviously will need it for this class onwards. Okay. I think that's it. So we may as well get started, and as it were now we're starting the substantive material properly, so called, by looking at the subject of jurisdiction as common law, which will take us a few weeks, I think, to work our way through. Now, starting at the beginning and just adding a little bit more detail to what we talked about in the previous class. As you know by now, there are these 2 different regimes, at least at the moment in England. There's the regulation, the EU regulation, and there's the common law rules on jurisdiction of English code. Now, what one has to bear in mind here is that the EU regulations first came into force in England, as I said last week, in 1987. The English common law rules that we're about to talk about, and some of them were developed much later than others, but they have their origins at least 400 years ago, maybe more. Okay? So it is not all of it, of course, but you are intrinsically comparing 2 very, very different legal systems. And of course, for most of those 400 years, until the last 30 odd years, this was the only set of rules in town. Okay? So they are, not surprisingly, sometimes referred to as the traditional rules. And that may sound a bit old-fashioned, really. But one knows what they mean. They're the ones that most of the English judges grew up with when they were practicing themselves. And they've had a very, very ingrained effect, I think, on how English judges think. Not just about their own common law rules, but about interpreting a European regulation. The second thing to say, as I think I said to you last week, is that if in practice, if you're trying to advise a client, you start with the common law rules before thinking about the regulation, you should probably ring up your professional indemnity insurers first, because it doesn't work like that in practice. In practice, the exact opposite is the case. The common law rule, the regulation will stipulate when it applies, by which it means it must be applied. And the common law is basically left up to mop up every situation that is not covered by the regulation. So an accurate way of describing the modern day role of the common law, at least unless it may change post-Brexit, but at the moment, is that the common law rules are residual. They apply where the regulation does not apply. Okay. What else do we need to say by way of preliminary? I will keep coming back to this diagram, and it will make more sense the more we go through this course. If this Venn diagram is all the rules of jurisdiction applied in, then a good way of thinking about it is that the EU regulation is, if you like, the dominant instrument. It applies to, or it's dominant in the sense of, as I say, if it requires to be applied, it has to be applied. There are two situations in which the common law applies in terms of this Venn diagram. One is matters that are outside the subject matter of the regulation altogether. So when we come to the regulation in a few weeks' time, you'll see that there are some whole areas of law. Not many commercial areas of law, though, but they tend to be more sort of family law areas. But there are some whole areas of law that are simply excluded from the regulation. Okay? And in those areas that don't come within the regulation, the English courts would, as long as there's no other European regulation, apply the common law. Okay? So there's subject matter outside the scope of the regulation. In the kind of things we're studying, business litigation, that isn't very much. That's perhaps 1 in 20 cases that you encounter in practice where you encounter an issue that's subject matter outside the scope. It's not much more common, and again this sounds very convoluted the way I'm putting it today, but I assure you that it's important. Much more common is that the subject matter does come within the scope of the regulation. It's a commercial dispute. It does come within the scope of the regulation. And so in principle, the first thing you need to pick up is the regulation. But when you get into the regulation, A, the regulation does not have an EU harmonised rule of jurisdiction in it for that situation. And B, the regulation specifically tells member states that because it does not have its own harmonised EU rule for that situation, they should apply their national rules of their own legal system. Let me say that again because it's such a fundamental point that everything flows from it. In most commercial cases, the subject matter will fall within the regulation, and therefore the first thing you have to pick up is the regulation. And in lots of scenarios, the regulation will have an EU harmonised rule that every member state has to follow. But there are some situations where the regulation does not have an EU harmonised rule. And in that situation, the regulation will instruct the courts of member states to apply whatever their individual national rules are instead, which in England is an instruction to apply our common law rules. Please ask if you want that again, because so much follows from that. In other words, in diagrammatic terms, the main commercial application of the regulation is because the subject matter is within the scope. Sorry, the main application of the common law is because the subject matter is within the regulation, but the regulation does not itself have a harmonised rule and therefore tells you to apply the question. Why is he going on about this? You might be wondering at this stage. And I can't fully answer that question this week, but I think what you do need to understand this week is that in most cases, the source of the power to apply the common law is the regulation. The regulation is telling you to do so. And the regulation has all kinds of effects, in terms of unexpected effects, if you've never studied it before, on how you can operate your common law rules. There's various bits of rules in the regulation, for example, on parallel proceedings, end up being superimposed onto the common law rules because the common law rules are not operating completely separately from the regulation. There is quite a complicated interaction between the two sets of rules that week one of substantive learning we can't possibly understand yet. Okay? And this diagram, I'm afraid, you will see again and again and again as we try and understand in the next few weeks and months exactly how the two sets of rules interrelate to each other. If all you've taken from what I just say is, in most commercial cases, you only apply the common law when the regulation tells you to apply the common law, then that's enough. Can I ask at this stage, does anybody want to ask any questions on that? Please do not be shy to ask any questions. Yeah.
As far as I understand, there are certain subject matters that are within the scope of regulation, but there's no harmonized rules, so you would apply.
Sorry, there are certain matters that are within the scope of the regulation. Yes, okay, I'm just coming to that. So the kind of things that are excluded, very, very few of them are commercial. They tend to be things like family law, maintenance law, and some very, very specific areas that we're not studying in this course anyway. I think you already know this from what I said last week, but it is still an oversimplification, and we'll have to clarify it in the weeks to come. But normally, the regulation will, for matters that are within its subject matter, in other words, normally the regulation will contain harmonised rules where the defendant is domiciled somewhere in the EU. There will normally be a harmonised rule in the regulation. In fact, almost always there will be. Where the defendant is domiciled outside the EU, and strictly speaking, I mean outside the EU or Norway, Iceland, or Switzerland as well, the regulation will normally not contain a harmonised rule. It will simply say, where the defendant's not domiciled in the EU, you should apply your national rules. Okay? So it's really, for today, we can say it's as simple as that. Okay? Now, that rule has exceptions. There are exceptional cases where the regulation does have a harmonised rule, even for non-EU domiciled defendants. But we certainly don't need to worry about these for several weeks, perhaps several months. We'll be ready today. Okay, that will do for that. All of which, bringing it back to something much, much simpler, is to say that in commercial cases, in 90% of cases, the common law rules will apply if the defendant is not domiciled in the EU, Norway, Iceland, or Switzerland, in 90% of cases. And that's, I think, the simplest way of working for today, was keeping in mind this point, because the common law is only doing that work because the regulation says it's allowed to do that work. And the full implications of that I simply can't explain it. Rather promise I'll come back. That means, in my view, and I will respectfully, gently criticise the Hartley book in that respect, some of these books proceed as if, the regulation is a huge subject, but some of them proceed as if the common law is rather an unimportant bit of the law now. And nothing could be further from the truth. Apart from 27 member states and 3 Lugano states, Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, so 30 countries in the world, the entirety of the rest of the world, where you have a defendant from the entirety of the rest of the world, it's the common law rules you look to. And so, clearly, in terms of numbers, in terms of population, that is the majority of the world. Okay. And if anything, I'd probably need to expand some of the material that's in here to explain some things more fully on the common law, given its decisive modern-day relevance. Okay. Having noted that diagram, I forget about it today. We will revisit it and just think of non-EU domicile defendants today as being the province of the common law. Okay. Does that make sense? that, in some ways, I think is the trickiest point we had to cover today, and it's partly tricky because I can't cover it all today. The next point is this, and I'm sure you've read about this in the books. Logically speaking, jurisdiction, the question of whether an English court can hear a case or can't hear a case, is one set of considerations. If you want to start proceedings against it, it doesn't really matter what country in the world it is. You're going to have to fill in some kind of document, aren't you? You can't just say I'm suing Harris now. You're going to have to file something, or do something. You have to fill in a form, whether it's an online form these days, it's over the years, or a paper form. You're going to have to fill in a form. Okay? What are you then going to have to do with the form before you can actually start proceeding with it in pretty much any country in the world? You're going to have to serve it. Okay? And different countries differ as to their rules of service. So this is not really very exciting. You might be really interested. I'm not going to teach you the detail of how you actually serve a document in a foreign country or indeed in England, because it's not very exciting, really. You're just looking at the manual on the whole. But it's completely logical to think that those two questions are different, isn't it? There's one question which is, I've got a cross-border dispute. Am I allowed to sue in England at all? Or do I have to go and sue in China or Russia or Peru or wherever it may be? That's one question. Our second question is, how do I serve a document on Harris in order to sue him? And any logical legal system, you might think, would regard that second question of service of documents as an integrated but a completely separate question. And it raises interesting questions like, in the modern world, am I allowed to serve it by email? Can I serve it by some kind of electronic app? If I know how to do it. Am I allowed to still use the fax? If I send it by post, does it have to be first class post? Does it have to be guaranteed delivery? All these kind of questions. I don't personally think they're very exciting, but they are questions. Okay, and different legal systems have different rules. But I don't think if you were starting with a blank piece of paper towards the end of 2018, you would say they're the same question. Can you sue here? And how do you serve the documents to start the proceedings? Because it's not logical. Unless anybody wants to disagree. But that is exactly how English common law developed, by treating the two things as the same. And it did that, and I think it's explained in the books, and it's explained in Hartley. Because what you do, and you've done this for at least the last 400 years in England, to start a claim, you do two things. Firstly, you get it issued by the court. What does issued mean? Yeah. Well, the first part is certainly all right. Issuing a claim form basically means lodging it with the court, paying your fee, getting it stamped, giving it back to you, giving so much money for it, and you've lodged it, and it's on their system. Issuing, I think lodging, is we use the word issue, but lodging gives you a better idea of it. You're lodging it. In an English system, you issue it first, by which I mean lodging with the court, and then you serve it. The court won't do it for you. You physically, as the claimant, it's your job to serve the defendant. Of course, I say your job. In reality, you will almost always have solicitors who will do that job, who you're paying, who will do that job for you. Strictly speaking, I suppose it's still technically the case. But it was certainly very explicitly the case hundreds of years ago. That claim form is issued in the name of the Crown. That seems delightfully old-fashioned. Therefore, technically speaking, that claim is issued in the name of the Queen. In the name of the King. And you've heard of the word, I'm sure, as summons before. That's where the word comes from. That's literally what it was. This document, you've been served with it, you are summoned, you are ordered to come to court and defend yourself. That's literally what it meant. Okay? And the idea was, if you've been served with this order to come to court, then you must come to court. It doesn't seem very sophisticated in 2018, but that was the idea. From that develops another idea, which is that when is the king or queen entitled to use to summon you to the English court? And the answer to that is when you've entered the sovereign territory of this country. So any of us, by choosing to be here, the idea was owes allegiance to the crown while they're here, and the crown is perfectly entitled to summon you. From this idea, which is very odd now, developed the idea that there was a huge difference between cases where you could be served within the jurisdiction and cases where you had to be served out of the jurisdiction. When I say served, I mean served with the documents that start the claim form, and any particulars of the claim which set it out in more detail. In England, you tend to find a claim form, which is quite a short document summarising what you're seeking, and then you tend to provide a much longer document called the particulars of claim, which set out a much greater length what your relation is. So, jurisdiction and service were pretty much synonymous, and as Hartley points out, until the 19th century, there was simply no idea of serving a claim form overseas. You just couldn't do it. Someone was either in the sovereign territory and you could serve them, or they weren't, and you could, and conversely, if they were out of the sovereign territory, they didn't owe allegiance to the crown or to the English courts, and therefore you couldn't serve them. You couldn't take jurisdiction. Because the English law developed the idea that if you were here, you were entitled to be sitting here because you'd entered the sovereign lands, this type of jurisdiction service within the jurisdiction became known as service as of right. You have a right to serve the claim form on somebody who is in England because they owe allegiance to the crown. Service as of right. Okay. Yeah. This concept of serving a claim form in England, when someone was in England, I called it their service within the jurisdiction, but it's often more frequently known as service as of right. As of right, as it sounds, you have the right as a claimant to serve a document on somebody who is in this country at the moment, who owns allegiance to the country. When the court has jurisdiction over somebody as of right, it means that they are within the sovereign lands. They are here. Now, that's pretty obvious if you think about it. If the defendant is an individual, it's usually possible to tell whether someone was here or not when they were served. Not always easy. If they're served at their home address and they say, well, I was on holiday at that time, there may be factual disputes, but generally it's fairly easy with an individual to tell an individual defendant whether they were here when they were purported to be served. When the defendant is accompanied, it's a lot more difficult to say. It's a lot more artificial to say, is a company here or is a company not here? Particularly if it's a foreign incorporated company that may have do some kind of business in England, but be incorporated, let's say, in Delaware. And one of the things we're going to talk about today is the more nuanced difficulty of working out whether whether a company is present in the country, so that it can be served in this country as of right. And we'll need to talk about that question in a few minutes' time, okay? Because that's not as straightforward as the question. But the general principle is the same for companies and individuals. If they are here, they can be served here, and the court has jurisdiction as of right. Okay. And if they are not here, since the 19th century, it has been possible to serve the claim form overseas out of the jurisdiction of the federal. And remember, when I say serve the claim form out of the jurisdiction of the federal, what I really mean is take jurisdiction over somebody who's not here, because the common law says that they're one and the same thing. If you can serve the document on someone in a foreign country, then at common law you have jurisdiction. Since the 19th century, it has been possible to serve a claim form on someone outside of the country, but you have no right to do it, and therefore you have to ask the permission of the court to do it. The crucial difference, if they're not here, they can't be served as of right, is you have to ask the court's permission to do it. Yeah. That's a good question, but the answer really is the court in which you intend to bring your claim. So if you're intending to start your claim in a commercial court, it's a commercial court's position. The English court's position. Not the courts with the pleasure of the person, but permission of the English court before which you're intending to bring that. Okay. And so, equally obviously, this is sometimes called service with permission of the court, for equally obvious reasons. Now let's stop immediately and say, who would come up with this rule in 2018? That there's all the difference in the world in terms of whether you can sue someone in a cross-border case, whether they happen to be in the country when you serve the claim form on them, or whether they happen not to be in the country. And my wager is none of us would come up with that as a sensible rule. It's terribly, quite old-fashioned, isn't it? It's very physical. You can imagine hundreds of years ago that it was much more difficult to enter or leave a country. You weren't doing transactions, over the internet, cross-border transactions at a flick of a button. Okay. Entering the country meant more, probably. It was a much more physical thing. You're either here and you're likely to do business here, or you're not here and you're probably not doing much business in a particular country. And the idea in these days of drawing this sharp distinction for jurisdiction between those who are here and those who are not doesn't perhaps sound very logical. But there are two things to say. One is, and this is not unique to this course, the pros and cons of the common law world is that we have a strict doctrine of precedent. In other words, once a court has decided that something is the law, only a higher appellate court can reverse, subsequently say that that is not the law. Okay. And once our highest courts in the land, which used to be called the House of Lords, but now is called the Supreme Court of the UK, has confirmed a principle, it is virtually impossible to overturn that principle. There are two ways it could be done. Very, very occasionally, the Supreme Court will say it's not going to follow its previous precedents. It does have a right to do that. It's extremely rare for it to do that. And secondly, it almost never does that, where that precedent has stood for hundreds of years, and everybody knows that that's the way that commercial litigation works. So the only way this would ever change in the real world is if the government enacted a statute getting rid of all of this. And I can tell you, the government's probably got enough on its plate in terms of legislation at the moment, but it would never happen anyway, because like it or dislike it, and it doesn't sound very sensible if you've never encountered it very before, but practitioners know that's how you do it. And so it is going to be there to stay, whether you like it or not. My own view is, as I say, starting with a black piece of paper, it's a fairly dark basis. Not partly because it fuses the question of can you sue here with the question of can you sue serve a document, but also because, as I say, it draws almost a naive distinction in the present day between those who are here and those who. But there we go. Secondly, when we are talking, as we are talking today, about jurisdiction as of right or jurisdiction by service in the jurisdiction, which for instance, Spain. As you already know by now, there are two elements to jurisdiction as of service within the jurisdiction. There is the question of whether you have jurisdiction, which is what we're going to be looking at today, which is simply determined by whether you can serve the claim form on someone in England. But whether you can serve them, even if you can serve them, what's the second stage? So stage one is you have to satisfy, you have to show that the English court has jurisdiction. But what's stage two? Should it exercise that? And nothing we're talking about today is dealing with that second question, the discretionary question. Should it exercise the jurisdiction, which is discretionary? Obviously, you don't get to that question unless you have a basis of jurisdiction. But just remember today that what we are looking at is, if you like, one half of the equation on this side. In relation to people who are served in England, we're basically looking today at half the story, and we'll be completing the story in the coming weeks by looking at that discretionary second element. We are not looking at it today. When it comes to service with permission, or what I called before service out, I can't draw that bright line between rules of jurisdiction and the discretionary element, because the judge always has a discretion whether to let you serve out or not. And when you appear before a judge and you say, please can I have permission to serve the claim form out of the jurisdiction, there is a mixture of rules and discretion, and they don't arise at a different time, they arise at the same time. You will first have to show that you fall within the rules to serve it out, but you'll also have to persuade the judge to exercise his or her discretion to let you do it in your favour. And it's very, very difficult to talk about that as a two-stage test, because although there are various ingredients of it, they all arise simultaneously. I suspect we won't get very far, if anywhere, with service out today, but we will look at it in much more detail next week. Okay? We'll look at it in much more detail next week. So really, what is important to understand today is we're going to be going through all of this, but for today, we're essentially up here. That's where we are today. Okay? Looking at serving someone in England as of right, without regard yet to the discretionary element. Okay, that's where we are. And having said all of that, with that lengthy introduction, we need to go back and make the distinction that I said a few minutes ago between defendants who are individuals and defendants who are companies. Okay? And there's more to say, substantially more to say, I think, about defendants who are companies. But let's start with defendants who are individuals. Can I ask you to turn up page 105? Very first case. I said we were going to look at judgments, and that's what we will do. Clearly, we would be here all night, every week, if I went through all of every judgment. So I'm going to pick out things, and I'm going to ask you what you think about those. Okay, but my starting case is Colt Industry, which is 105. The number in square brackets, you can see the name of the case, and then you can see below it square brackets 1966. That's the year the judgment was reported. Usually the same year it was handed down. So 50 odd years ago. And Hartley describes the facts, which fortunately are incredibly simple in this case. The claimant had a grievance with the defendant. The defendant didn't live here. The defendant's individual didn't live here, but came to England for a few days to stay in a hotel. They're not domiciled here, they're a resident here. They've not got a strong connection here, but they came to England for a few days to stay in a hotel. Nothing to do with that hotel was nothing to do with that stay was nothing to do with the agreement that they'd entered into with the claimant. They just happened to be here for a few days. Okay. Served, welcome to the UK, here's your claim form. Okay? That's essentially what happens. And the question is very simply, is that enough to establish jurisdiction as of right over the defendant, the fact that they are served? But the answer isn't very surprising, but I think there are a couple of points that I would take you to. Sometimes they're actually important points in the commentary rather than in the extra. So if I could take you to the middle of page 106. In the bit that's not shaded in grey, Hartley refers to a case called Carrick and Hancock, which, if you follow footnote 14 down, will immediately take you back to 1895. So we're already back into the 19th century in terms of English precedent and trying to work out what the law is. Okay. And in that case, the court was asked a similar question. Well, we don't have Carrick and Hancock with us included in this material, but if you read to the middle of that paragraph on the middle of that page, it's a shame we don't have Carrick and Hancock, but if you read that, you'll see that, and this is all correct, in Carrick and Hancock, the court decided the case by looking at a case called Calvin's case. Have a look and follow the footnote reference down from Calvin's case, footnote 15, and you will see that we've landed back in 1608. And the principle from 1608, which the court follows in Carrick in 1895, and which this judge in 1966 says, well, it's too late now not to follow, because we've had this precedent for hundreds of years already, 360 years already at that stage. And look at that quotation in the middle bit from Calvin's case. When an alien in amity cometh into England, because so long as he is within England, he is within the king's protection. Therefore, so long as he is here, he oweth unto the king a local obedience or allegiance. For the one, as it hath been said, draweth the other. Okay, it sounds like something from William Shakespeare, doesn't it? But you get the idea. You come to England, you get the king or queen's protection. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but we sort of get the idea. But with it comes the downside that I can send a claim form on you from London. Here's the claim. And essentially the case is decided as simply as that, if you go into the grey bit at the bottom of that page, that the court basically says that if you come here, you owe allegiance to the crown, and that is that. If you are in other words, the ratio of this case, the decision is, if you are present in England as an individual, then you can be served here as of right if you're here. Before you are served. Simple as that. There's only one partial exception to that, which is mentioned at the top of page 107. What is that partial exception? Sorry? Yeah, what will be an example of fraud in this context? Yeah, come here, I've got a great business deal to strike with you. When we get out of Heathrow, I'm only joking. Easy to say, nice classroom example, never seen it in my life, and would be surprised if I ever do see it in my life, or if ever encountered anyone who ever has seen it in their life. But it's a nice thing that we should note. That exists as a potential exception, but not perhaps something to get too worried about in the ordinary course of events, I would say. And interestingly, as Hartley notes, that was as far as the case goes. We have three levels, for those who don't know, of appeal: High Court, Court of Appeal, what used to be the House of Lords, but now is the Supreme Court at the top. You need permission to go to any appellate court, and it's particularly hard to get permission to go to the highest court, and no permission was granted. Because it was too obvious. Everybody knows the law. We had it since 1606, 1608. Okay, at least. It's almost silly, in a way, to ask you the question, but I will ask it at the moment. Ask you, are you convinced by the argument based on allegiance? But I can't. Let's have a look at another case, and then let's have a little discussion about it before we move on to the okay. Very similar kind of case, and actually, therefore, I think we can take it much more quickly. Is the Maharani of Baroda case, which you'll find on page 108. Now, the long and the short of this dispute is that the defendant, again, was resident in France. This is obviously long before there was a European regulation in force in the United Kingdom, so don't be put up by the fact that the defendant was resident in France. The defendant came to England for a short stay to go to the horse race, and was served with a claim form whilst here, and a similar issue. A similar issue arose in this case before Lord Denning. And really, I don't think we need to go through all of this because the conclusion is the same. But let me show you the second paragraph on page 109 is perhaps what we need to go to. About 5 lines down, Lord Denning says, if a defendant is properly served with a writ, let me just stop you there. For several hundred years, we used to call a claim form a writ. And then someone decided about 2000 that we should speak in plain English to make our business intelligible to the rest of the world, which I think is an optimistic assumption. So these days we're supposed to call them claim forms. I do not care which one you use. A writ is a claim form and a claim form is a writ. And I will probably use those interchangeably. They're the same thing. They are the document with which you start proceeding. If a defendant is properly served with a writ while in this country, or albeit on a short visit, the plaintiff is primarily facie entitled to continue the proceedings to the end. He has validly invoked the jurisdiction of the Queen's Court, and is entitled to require those courts to proceed to adjudicate upon his claim. Okay? I don't think I really need to repeat that because that's the same reasoning all over again. Indeed, you may wonder why this point keeps coming up. Probably because a lot of claimants and their lawyers, a lot of defendants and their lawyers couldn't really believe it was that simple. That they stepped into the country, they had nothing to do with this country, and they weren't here for reason anything to do with their dispute with the claimant. Could they really be subject to being sued in England? I don't believe it. But yes, you can. You are limited. Subject to that forward point without being true. Let's stop for a minute and think about this. Who's a fan or not a fan of this rule, that if you're present here, the English court has jurisdiction over you if you're served here? And I suppose the converse proposition that if you're not present here as an individual, then you've got to go through a much, much more complicated process to try and establish the jurisdiction of the court because someone is not present. What could be said for or against it? Shout out anything you want to say. Okay, you've chosen an argument in favour of that. And I think a good argument, actually, although some of you may say that if you can have any rule that's simple, it doesn't make it a good rule. But it's true. It's a serious point. It is a simple proposition in most cases to tell whether someone was present. And you do get hard cases, there's no doubt you get cases where people turn around and say, you served it at my house, but I was away skiing. I've had that kind of case before. Exactly that, actually. And very, very wealthy people, defendants whom you might act for, are more likely to live very international lives. And it's a bit of a mess. And usually what you end up doing is serving absolutely every address they've ever been at. And sometimes applying for permission to serve out as well, just to be sure that you get the person. I tell you what else is a common tactic, something really mean-spirited. A very good time to serve people who are difficult to serve. It tends to be around Christmas time. It's a new year. And it's, I think I'm arguing against the point you made, but I'll carry on this thread of thought. It's not unusual to see cases where private investigators are hired to track people's movements so that they can serve them while they are in the country. Actually, that's not going to get them, because I think it's completely ludicrous. But subject to those points, the trouble is when you're sort of talking like in this sort of way, like I am, is you can emphasise where things go wrong. But as a general rule, I think what you say is correct. There aren't many disputes. Whereas if you had a test like, say, residence, the upside would be, if someone's resident here, then you could be pretty sure that they have a serious connection here. In a more meaningful sense, if you're resident here, if you pay your taxes here, then it does make some sense to say you owe an allegiance to the crown. If you step foot in the country, yes, I suppose in one sense you do know that you're answerable to the laws of the country you set foot in. Everybody knows that. And maybe actually it's not such a silly idea. Okay, we wouldn't put it in 2018 in terms of owing allegiance to the Queen. None of you would, probably, maybe you would, but I wouldn't put it in that terms. I set foot in the country, I owe allegiance to the Queen. But you probably wouldn't deny the proposition that if you set foot in a country, you have to comply with its laws. So there are some logical things to be said for it. Anything else that you could say in favour of that? Yeah.
But can still be corrected by the second step, by the discretion source, or like it's just never any complication of law, just the first steps.
Yes, that I think is an extremely important point. We are looking at half of the puzzle at the moment. And if the defendant really does have no other connection with the UK, with England, and they ask the court not to exercise jurisdiction over them, because it's more appropriate for the case to do that somewhere else, they are likely to succeed. And it may be an extremely expensive mistake on part of the defendant to have started those proceedings in this circumstance, where they're going to end up being dismissed or stayed, and the claimant's going to have to pay all the money at the end of the process. So yes, it's hard to judge a test when you're actually only looking at half of the overall law on jurisdiction. The other point I would make, which sort of goes with that point, is this. Sometimes defendants have got no interest in spending money, believe it or not, I don't know why, in spending money on lawyers who can advise on jurisdiction and challenge jurisdiction. They just want to get on with the trial and get it over with. And having a very simple procedure to serve some people who actually aren't that bothered, they just want to get the case determined one way or the other in England or anywhere else, it avoids complexity. You serve the defendant, they don't want to challenge jurisdiction, you get on with it. Rather than having a very elaborate process for serving somebody through some other procedure who was never actually intending to challenge jurisdiction in the first place. Right? At least, again, it's related to the simplicity point, but I think these points are all interconnected. On the other hand, as a point I made last week, should we be overstating this point, that the defendant can always challenge jurisdiction? What's the downside of that from the defendant's point of view? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and going back one stage means you've got to do something. Because if I serve you as a right when you come to the horse races, and you don't do anything, and you ignore the claim form, what's going to happen? What's the judge going to do? Yeah, well, firstly, they go on to deal with essentially, they'll go on to the merits. If there's no challenge to jurisdiction within 28 days, they'll go on to the merits. And if there's still no defence on the merits, they'll give a default judgment on the merits against the defendant. So, exactly as you say, that means, oh my goodness, I've got to get an English lawyer. You want how much per hour? Even if it's something fairly straightforward, there's always the risk of losing. There's always the risk you'll be up against a claimant with extremely deep pockets, who's got very expensive lawyers who will make it as complicated as possible. And therefore I think that in fact, I'm not saying it is a complete answer, but it's not a perfect answer. And the other thing I would say is, remember what I said last week? I think claimants already hold most of the advantages in international litigation. They choose whether and when and where to sue. And if you add to those advantages the fact that you can sue someone as of right in England if they just happen to walk into the country at any stage, and you've only got to bear in mind 6 years in England to bring a claim after an event you can claim that has happened or you're kind of aware of that. If at some point in the next 6 years they enter the country, there's a huge presumption that unless they do something, that you can sue them. And you could say such a weak test, such a weak connection with the defendant, just exaggerates all the power that's already in the hands of the claimant. It's very one-sided as a test. Anything else anyone wants to comment on about what can be said for or against this rule? I suppose the only other thing I would say, which is related to that, is that in the end, where cases are started has a huge implication, as Brent told you, of what the outcome is, what defendants and claimants are prepared to settle for. And being able to serve someone as a right, whatever anyone says, puts the claimant right in the driving seat in terms of trying to get, because the defendant's got to do something, or normally they're worried about having to spend money. It already puts the claimant, that's going to tell us you've been dirty up already. Because you've started the initiative, you've got your claim served, you've got jurisdiction as of right. And all of these things, tend to give the claimant a significant advantage. Anyway, that's all very well by academic criticism, but the bare reality is I can say whatever I like. That law's not going to change. And at least it's very, very simple. So if you're asking a comment on what you think about it, fire away with your criticisms to an exam question. If you just ask the proposition what it is, it's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Which brings us to companies. And companies are a much more complicated beast. Now, our interest here is really in foreign companies, by which I mean companies that are not incorporated in England, don't have their principal place of business in England either, and don't have their central administration in England. We're talking about basically non-EU companies, companies where all of those things are outside the EU and the Wales and Switzerland, so not incorporated in the UK or anywhere in the EU. When I say EU, I won't bother to say the Wales and Switzerland as well, but the point, they don't have their principal place of business in the EU, and they don't have their central administration. In other words, their board meetings don't take place in the EU. Foreign. The reason we're interested in foreign companies is because if the company does have any of those things, if it is incorporated in the EU or has its principal place of business or central administration somewhere in the EU, then, as you'll see in a few weeks' time, it will be deemed to be domiciled in the EU. And if it's domiciled in the EU, then we wouldn't be talking about the common law rules at all. We'd be talking about EU. So I'm talking about can I just put it this way, non-EU companies, to use a rather general phrase. Non-EU companies that nonetheless do business in England. Now, there are all sorts of ways you could do business in England. You could have a branch. What's a branch? Subsidiaries are not branches, but they are very important. What's a branch, first of all?
It's an extension of the main company.
It is, but a formal one that is registered to do business with the benefits and burdens that entails in a particular jurisdiction. So it's a formally registered office of a company, completely under its control, owned by it, but and registered. What's a subsidiary by contrast?
A company wholly owned by the company.
It doesn't have, it doesn't have to be wholly owned by the parent company. It's a company which is formed underneath a parent company, certainly. So you'll have a parent company, and you will have a subsidiary which may or may not own all of the shares in that subsidiary. It's formed as a kind of sub-branch of the company. But crucially, what's the difference between a subsidiary and a branch? Yeah. A subsidiary has its own legal identity and is separate from the parent company. I'm sure many of you know the concept of the so-called corporate veil, that although a subsidiary is sort of under the parent company, it is independent. And just because the subsidiary does something, it doesn't mean you can sue the parent, and vice versa. That's the difference between that and the branch. And some companies don't have either. They just happen to do business in England. They don't have a formally registered branch. They don't have a formally registered branch. They just turn up here. The example we'll see in a few minutes is turning up at trade fairs, for example. No branch, nothing. But could you say that they don't do any business in England? No, you couldn't. Okay. So the most informal thing, I suppose, would just be a place of business, okay, but not a formally registered branch. And there are people who don't even have a place of business. The managing director might just fly all around the world to go to meetings, you know? Or it may come here. Its contact with the UK may be so minimal that you couldn't really say that it even has a place of business. Now, here's something very, very peculiar and very unsatisfactory, and I would say with the greatest of respect to Professor Hartley, this is not brilliantly explained in his book. The basic rule is still exactly the same, that whether you can serve as a right is determined by whether the company is in the jurisdiction. With the same rule as the privilege. But of course it's a lot harder to say whether a foreign incorporated company is in the jurisdiction, because it depends what you mean by in the jurisdiction. And that's what we have to talk about. Now, you can serve a company that's in the jurisdiction, but very, very confusingly, the rules on when and how you can serve a company in the jurisdiction are contained in two completely different places. One is the Companies Act 2006, and the other is in the English Civil Procedure Rules, which I may as well say now. Almost everybody abbreviates Civil Procedure Rules to CPR. And since you probably want to save time in an exam, I will simply suggest you use that term, CPR, but that's all it means, Civil Procedure Rules. In particular, in Rule 6.3. So the rules that determine whether you can serve a company are contained in two different places, which is fine if I was going to go on and tell you what the interaction between the two of them is. But the answer is, there is no interaction. You can use either of them to serve a company, as long as you satisfy the criteria for service under either the Companies Act or the Civil Procedure Rules, then you can serve a foreign company in England as a branch. Basically, you've got two alternative regimes, and they live pretty much in splendid isolation from each other. They don't interact, they are alternatives criteria. But the rules on service, for all practical purposes, are identical in both of them. So it doesn't really make much difference if you purport to serve under the Companies Act or you purport to serve under the Civil Procedure Rule Part 6.3, because the rules are the same. Okay. And what I need to do before this is the uninteresting bit, before we get to the interesting bit, which I might as well warn you about. I don't think Hartley explains clearly enough what the modern day relevance of all those cases that we're about to look at is. And I think I need to explain it to you first. And it's this. Under the Companies Act 2006, and you will find it on page 111, sorry, I should have written 60 versus 0.9 there, and I'll explain to you what 6.3 does in a minute. Under the Companies Act, there is a section which is part 34 of the Act, which deals with service on so-called overseas companies. And an overseas company, as you can see in section 1044, and I don't pretend there's anything at all exciting about this, but indeed you have my promise that this is, in my view, one of the dullest things we ever have to look at. And certainly the dullest thing on the common law. I don't think it was that such a good decision after all. An overseas company is a company incorporated outside the UK. Now, if a company is incorporated outside the UK, then what it has to do is this is the other problem with Harley. If you look at paragraph 1046, it starts to say something very convoluted about the Secretary of State may by provision make regulations, blah, 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 which is very confusing. Basically, in England, we have Acts of Parliament, and occasionally we have so-called secondary legislation, which is easier to enact, which simply implements the details of the statute. And they are usually called statutory instruments, those kind of things. And section 1044 is saying basically that this Act can be supplemented by a statutory instrument, a secondary piece of legislation. And what Hartley admits to tell you is that there was an important secondary piece of legislation called the Overseas Companies Regulations 2009, which really needs to be read alongside the sort of procedures. Really needs to be read alongside the Companies Act 2006. What I'm going to tell you now is a mixture of what you see on that page from the Act and the way it's supplemented by the regulations. It won't take more than 5 minutes, I promise, because I don't think we need to go into the details. But essentially it's this. The effect of section 1046 that you can see there, and regulation 4 out of the Overseas Companies Regulations 2009 that you can't see there, which is enacted pursuant to it, is this. If a foreign company, an overseas company, opens what is called a UK establishment, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. If a foreign company opens a, quote, UK establishment, explanation to follow, although not a very good explanation, I should warn you, because it's not very well defined, it has to provide to the registrar of companies, which is like the official person responsible for implementing companies law in the country, it has to provide to the registrar of companies details of whatever UK establishment or establishments is opened, and it has to provide an address where that UK establishment can be served with going forward. To put it differently, if you open a UK establishment, you can be sued here as of right, but you should simply notify the registrar of companies which place you can be served as of right in the UK. You can't avoid being sued as of right if you open a UK establishment, but you can say to the registrar, this is the address where I should be sued as of right, where I should be served as of right. And you must do that within 1 month. Again, that's stated in regulation number 4 of these regulations. You've only got a month, not very long, after opening a UK establishment to tell the registrar of companies. And essentially, if you don't tell the registrar of companies within a month where you can be served, then you can be served anywhere in the United Kingdom. So if you've got a establishment in London and one in Birmingham and one in Manchester, it's in your interest to notify the registrar of companies within a month, because if you fail, you can be served at anything. And you can see that basically in section 1139. Which says that you can serve a document on a company by leaving it at or sending it by post to the company's registered office, but more importantly, you can serve it on an overseas company by leaving it or sending it at the registered address of anyone registered in the UK authorised to accept service. So that's what you notify the registrar of companies as the place where you're authorised to accept service, but it might also be if you've instructed a solicitor and you've told the other side that you will accept service at your solicitor's office, then the document can be sent there. And you can see 1139B, if there isn't anyone or you aren't able to effect service there, or for any other reason you can't effect service, you can send it to any place of business of the company. That's a longhand way for saying that if you open a UK establishment, tell the registrar of companies where you can be served, and if you don't, you can be served anywhere. What you can't avoid is being subject to jurisdiction as a right if you open a UK establishment. What's a UK establishment, you ask? And I wish I could give you a better explanation than the one I'm about to give you. A UK establishment is defined in Regulation Number 2 of the 2009 regulations, and it's a pretty terrible definition. A UK establishment is either a branch within the meaning, and I'm not a company lawyer, but there are various European directives on substantive company law. A branch is, a UK establishment is defined in the regulations to be either a branch within the meaning of the 11th European Community Companies Directive. So a UK establishment means a branch within the meaning of the EC 11th Company Directive. More on that in a moment, but not very much. Or, and this is a great definition, a place of business that is not a branch. So a UK establishment is a branch, or it's not a branch, but nonetheless a place of business. And I wish I could give you a better definition, but it's almost blame me for that. Or a place of business which is not a branch. You might as well, now you might be saying to me at the moment, what does branch mean? Okay, branch is defined to be whatever it means in the 11th EC Company Directive. I really want to know at this time of night what the definition of a branch is in the 11th EC Company Directive. There is no definition of a branch in the 11th EC Company Directive. There is quite a lot of ECJ case law on it. But let me short-circuit things at nearly 7:20 on a Tuesday night and say this. When we come to look at the recast judgments regulation later in the term, there is an article in the recast judgments regulation, I know it's a completely separate regime, which deals with branches. Inter alia deals with branches. It's Article 7.5 of the recast judgments regulation. And when we do look at that, much later in the term, much, probably virtually at the end of the term, you will be introduced to what the ECJ's definition of a branch is in that context. And I think all I need to say for tonight is branch, for the purposes of what a UK establishment is, almost certainly means exactly the same as the definition of branch that we'll look at in the ECJ case law when we come right at the end of the term to look at Article 7.5 of the regulation. And if I were you, I'd just simply write that in your notes, and when we come back to revise this, it'll all make sense. Okay? I won't spend any more time talking about what a branch means under European law. Partly because it's too early, not too early at this time of night, but too early in the course. Partly because it's incredibly uninteresting, but mostly because it doesn't actually matter, because if you actually think about this definition, a UK establishment is a branch or not a branch, but still a place of business. If I turn that into a more simple proposition, if you've got any kind of place of business here, whether it's a branch or not, you can be sued as a right. That's the proposition you need to take out of that very tedious legislation. If you've got a place of business here, you can be sued as a right. Whether it's a branch, yes, definitely is a place of business, but things that aren't a place of a branch may be a place of business too. And to cut a long story short, the Civil Procedural Paragraph 6.9, if you really want to know, it's 6.9.7, Paragraph 7. If you decide to use that regime instead, it sets out a table. It says a claim form must be served on the defendant at the place shown in the following table. And by the way, this is not in Hartley, unfortunately. If you Google Civil Procedure Rules Part 6, you'll immediately find them for free without any difficulty. And what CPR 6.9 subparagraph 7, if you use that route instead, says is you could serve a company at, and I quote, any place of business of the company within the jurisdiction. In other words, it's the same test. Whether you use the Companies Act or the Civil Procedure Rules, in the end, a very short way of cutting through it all is that you can serve a company if it's got a place of business in the country and you can't, as of right, and you can't if it hasn't. Okay? And I think that is a good way of cutting through some fairly turgid material. You do need to know something about the material I just talked about. But that's how it all clicks together. Okay? And that is why the case law we're about to look at in Hartley is relevant still in 2018, because although they predate all of this stuff in the Companies Act, most of these cases, the Companies Act and the Civil Procedure Law, they're all about the definition of when a company has a place of business here, and therefore they are still good law on the question of whether you can serve a foreign company as a right in England or not, because they are about the question of when does a company have a place of business. Okay? Does that make sense? Let me introduce one more idea. In fact, I don't need to introduce it. I can take you to the distinction because it's beautifully set out for you. If you have a look at the case of Adams and Cable Industries, which is set out, a more recent case than some, 1990. It starts on page 115, but I just want to tell you, I'm going to come back to it right at the end of today. But first of all, I want to take you to page 116, to the very top paragraph. And then I'm going to leave this case and come back to it in a few minutes. A further distinction in relation to a defendant that is a company is drawn in the case law. And it's beautifully set out there in paragraph 1 of the court's decision in Adams. And it says this: the English courts will likely treat a company incorporated under the laws of one country, an overseas country, as present, notice, still trying to apply this present test, within the jurisdiction of the courts of another, only if 1. It is established and maintained at its own expense a fixed place of business of its own for more than a minimal period of time. So that is the best definition of a place of business. You won't find a better one. A place of business exists where a company establishes and maintains at its own expense a place of business for more than a minimal period. That's what a place of business is. Exactly as described in Adams. I've written it up on the board, but you can see it there in one subparagraph 1. It's established and maintained at its own expense, fixed place of business. It's only in the other country for more than a minimal period. That's a place of business. Okay? That is what I would describe as direct presence. In other words, a foreign company has its own place of business in England. Okay? A foreign company has its own place of business in England. Remember what we were talking about a few minutes ago about subsidiaries, and we said subsidiaries are not a parent company's own place of business because they are separate. Yeah? It is, however, possible that you have a subsidiary in England, so a separate company. It might be a Delaware company with an English subsidiary. It's a separate company in theory, but in practice, it does the Delaware company's work in England. It goes out and tries to get business for the parent company. It's all a bit confused when you go into the London office of the subsidiary. You can pick up stationery there, which has got the details of the Delaware company on it. You know, the Delaware company uses the office in London of the subsidiary from time to time. So you can imagine situations where A company doesn't have its own, what you could call its own place of business in England. But, if you like, it indirectly does business in England. The most obvious route is through a subsidiary, which, although formally separate, does in practice do work with the parent, or it's all confused. Or you may not have a subsidiary at all, but you may have an agent whose job in England is to generate work for you. So they may be independent of you, but they may in fact be generating business. Their job may be to generate business for you. They might work for other companies as well, but they may be working for you as well. And the second bullet point that the court is referring to there is that situation. The alternative is that a representative of the company has for more than a minimal period of time been carrying on the overseas company's business in the other country at or from some fixed place of business. So the other way of being present is indirectly through typically an agent or subsidiary who themselves is based in England for a more than a minimal period. And that basic distinction is quite important between directly having your own place and not having your own place, but effectively having someone who's doing your work for you. Right? And it can't be right. That would be form over substance, wouldn't it? If you could avoid being sued in England by, rather than setting up your own company in England, just setting up a subsidiary and saying, well, that's separate. I can't be sued. Although you actually use its offices all the time, although it generates work for you, although it uses the same stationery, although you pay the upkeep of its office, you say, no, it's a separate company, so I can't be sued in England. So the law has developed the idea that you can also be indirectly present through an agent or subsidiary. And we need to look at both, and we'll try and do that in the half an hour that remains today. So firstly, let's look at this column, the direct presence. In other words, does a foreign company have its own place of business in England? Let's have a look at a couple of cases and we'll get a sense of how easy or difficult it is to acquire a place of business in this country. Have a look at the case of Dunlop first, which is on page 112. Here you have a company, which was a independent company, which was German, but again, this is long before there was any European regime or European regulation. It's 1902. Okay? So don't put off by the fact that the defendants got so in the EU. German company hires a stand at an exhibition, a bicycle stand, just for selling bicycles, which takes place at Crystal Palace, still, I'm sure you know, a very major exhibition centre in London all these years later. So one can imagine that this was a pretty major, if you look at the history of this, Crystal Palace exhibition centre is very large scale, pretty major events, one would imagine. But the stand was only there for 9 days, and then it was gone. This wasn't a case of potential indirect presence, because the company sent its own staff, or alternatively employed its own people, specifically for this stand. So they didn't use an agent, so they didn't use a subsidiary, they used their own employees. Okay, so there was no question of them being present as through an agent. They were either here or they weren't here through their own presence. And the question, to cut a long story short, is 9 days enough to be said to be had? So the claimant has some presumably prior grievance against the defendant and goes up to the stand and says, can the company be sued as a right? Does it have a place of business maintained at its own expense for more than a minimal period of time? In some ways, you might think the last bit of that is the most crucial item. Is this long enough? It's not very long. And if you go right to about 4 lines up from the bottom of that page, the Master of the Rolls says, just after footnote 2, makes the point that they did hire the premises exclusively for their use, And they employed their own staff. That's the point I've already made. They didn't use agents, they came in themselves. And he says, the only difficulty is that they were only here for 9 days. And the defendant said, moving on to the next page, that length of time is an essential ingredient in deciding whether someone can acquire a place of business. You can't acquire a place of business if you're only here for 9 days. And the court says, yes, it's relevant. I agree, it's an element to be considered. It's relevant. But the fact that it's only carried on for a limited period does not mean that it cannot acquire a place of business. It says about 7 lines down. A period of 9 days is not necessarily a negligible quantity. It may in many cases be a very substantial period. In the case of an exhibition, which is largely resorted to by manufacturers for the purpose of exhibiting a particular class of goods, and by customers desirous of purchasing such goods, as much business in the kind of goods exhibited may probably be done in 9 days as in many months in an ordinary town. It goes on to say, I won't take you through all of it, about 7 lines from the end, that a substantial part of the defendant's business was selling to manufacturers, and that was exactly what they were doing when they were here in Crystal Palace, selling at the exhibition. Conclusion, German company did have a place of business through its 9 days of presence here. And in fairness, the court isn't saying it had a place of business just because it was here for 9 days, and 9 days is always enough. It's saying and unfortunately the common law is often frustratingly difficult to pin down a fixed test. It's a combination of factors. 9 days isn't that short, but it's particularly not short when you think about what this exhibition was and how important it was to the company, and the kind of commercial opportunities it offered to this particular company, having regard to the sector in which they were involved, and the kind of people who would turn out looking to buy. It was a significant commercial undertaking to be at this exhibition for 9 days. The company had a place of business here. Who thinks the result is right, or who thinks the result feels wrong? Any views? 9 days, place of business.
I think on the summary, the judge's opinion is about the fact that it's placing that 9 days is the dream.
I mean, what you're not going to have is an office. You're not going to be probably taking out a lease. You'll have a stand for a period of time. There's no lease. You're not paying electricity and rent and tax to the council. You're not probably paying taxes here at all. But you haven't set up office in that sense, in the normal sense of if you're going to do business here, the first thing you think of is where we're going to work. Okay? And none of that exists in this case. It doesn't feel, to me, it doesn't feel like what in colloquial speak we would say a place of business. Saying that a stand and an exhibition is where you do your business is a pretty strained interpretation of the facts of the case. I think that is certainly true. Any other comments?
I think the court was right to kind of take all the circumstances of the case into consideration and not just say, 9 days is minimal, because they did go to this exhibition, they did show their bikes, they did find manufacturers, and they could have potentially, conducted deals, so they did conduct business in those 9 days. So it could have found as a place.
I agree, and it was clear they wouldn't have been there unless there was a big commercial opportunity. I think you missed it.
Yes, and the point, I mean, 1902 they could just hop on a plane and go to the exhibition. That was quite a
That's also a very good point, isn't it? It was probably a really quite a significant investment.
They managed to get deals that they wouldn't have otherwise not have managed to get.
All of this is true. I think they did, from what you can tell, hire some English staff, but they still went to the trouble of doing it.
Just about what I'd love to know, can you say that the law has changed now? If you're in the future, if you're in Adams are giving those tools?
I don't. That's a very good question, but I don't think that if you read the whole judgment, there's any indication that the previous cases are wrong or wrongly decided. So I would be surprised if that was the case. Just to make the point that a number of you have made, that actually this company was getting quite a significant commercial benefit, and I think we all can imagine, that was probably the case. Okay. Does anyone know, did this claim form have anything to do with business that it was transacting in London? It had nothing to do with it. One of the questions Hartley asked, which is a perfectly fair question, is, do you think there should be a further, even if this is long enough, do you think there should be a requirement that the claim and issue arises out of the activities of that company in England? Or do you think it's enough that they're just here? Yeah.
It's kind of the same principle that applies on individuals. It's not necessarily that they can conduct something in England, but once they're in the country, you can serve.
I think that's a very fair point. The point is, it doesn't help an individual who comes to the country to go to the horse race and to say, well, yeah, but I wasn't here for a business proposition. And you could say there's at least some logic and symmetry there. It shouldn't help a company either to say, well, this has got nothing to do with my business. Again, it has that merit of simplicity, doesn't it? Getting into a test of, is this, and the EU test, when we look at the regulation, initially the ECJ said under the EU regulation that should arise out of, impose quite a strict requirement that something arise out of activities in London. And there's road back from it because it actually causes a lot of uncertainty, that kind of test as well. Okay? And as we said, there's some advantage to making this easy. At least if we all know it's quite easy to get a place of business here, at least if we all know it doesn't matter whether the dispute arose out of what the business did when it was here, we all kind of know the rules. If you come to England, you set up anything, you're at strong risk of being sued. And in terms of owing allegiance, why not? If individuals could be present for a few hours and be served. A company that's here for 9 days, why should it get offered? Why should companies, often with much deeper pockets, be in a better position in terms of being sued as of right, you might say, than individuals? So there is a lot to be said for this. On the other hand, it is hazardous. It means that coming to, it's almost a discouragement to people to come into the country. In a few weeks' time, you'll see, for example, Christmas markets popping up all over the place. I think it would be difficult, I think, for anybody who sets up a stall at a Christmas market to say that they don't have a place of business in England. It seems to me that that's at least as strong a connection, with all probability, as setting up a bicycle stand at an exhibition. So it is a test that's very easy to acquire. It has all the problems, but it forces the defendant, which by definition is a foreign company, to do something in England, to bring a jurisdiction challenge. But there is some logic to it in relation to the relationship to individuals. On the other hand, if you're being critical, you can say, well, I don't like the individual test either. It's too liberal, and two wrongs don't make a right. Just because the individual test is too easy, that's not an argument of having a really easy rule for companies as well. The whole thing is wrong. One other example, and then I'm just going to come back to this and ask you one more thing, to consider one other thing today. Much shorter case on the next page is South India shipping. And the simple point in this case is that you have a Korean bank which opens an office in London. Much, much, much more putting down roots in London because it hires its own premises, staffs its own employees. In any reasonable sense, this company could not deny that it opened, in one sense, a place of business in England. Much stronger case. Except that this place of business was not trying to get business from the English public at all. It wasn't open for business. It wasn't a shop. It wasn't selling its banking wares. It was basically, as far as one could tell, some kind of administrative office. It dealt with various bits of the administration. It gathered information, as Hartley says. It found some contacts that it thought would be sent back to Korea and said, we met these people, we think you might want to deal with them. But it didn't have any outward-facing business. It didn't crop up in the high street and say, expat, you could walk in and do this if you just couldn't. In that sense, it had no real public face. And the question was, can you have a place in business in England when you're not dealing with the public? And I think the answer that Lord Justice Attlee gives is, once you've read, although it's 80 years later, once you've read Dunlop, you won't be surprised by the answer. It's got its own place of business, seeks to give publicity to the Korean bank and to encourage trade between, in about the middle of that short paragraph, between Korea and the UK. Therefore has a place of business in the UK, and it doesn't matter that it doesn't conclude any banking transactions or have any dealings with the general public. So public facing is not necessary. Do you think that decision sounds right? That if you open an office here, whether it has any dealings with the public or not, you have a place of business. Does that sound right? It's difficult to see why not. Individuals that enter the country don't have to be offering any services when they go to the horse racing. It's very difficult to see why a company which goes to the trouble of having its own premises, after all, they must have them for some commercial reason, should be able to escape from this kind of thing. But what you get is the idea now that it's actually pretty easy to establish a place of business. On the other hand, it's still incredible. All this is still incredibly fiscal, isn't it? Leaving aside the issue of subsidiaries and agents for the moment, in 2018, and it's probably been the case for many years, there's a very obvious way of doing business in England, which may not require you ever even to set foot in the country. What is that very obvious way of doing business in England without even setting foot in the country? Sorry? You provide online services. Now, sometimes it's difficult to tell whether you're targeting the UK, because an awful lot of websites in the world are in English, and if they're not in English, an awful lot of websites are in English, and it's particularly hard to say if they are, for example, from the United States, where that is the first language as well. But even if it's not the first language, it's not unreasonable, for example, for a company in a jurisdiction where the language is not widely spoken around the world to also offer an English language version of their website. We've all seen that kind of website as well. Question. If you are a Delaware company, if you are targeting, let's say it's unambiguous, it lists its shipping rates, for example, is a good way of telling, and one of the rates when you scroll down is shipping to the United Kingdom. So it's absolutely unambiguous that it's targeting the UK. It may even be sending you junk emails to your address, which couldn't be anything else because it ends .co.uk. Or your King's email, which I assume ends .something.ac.uk. I'm sure you've got one of those. Is that company going to be subject to the jurisdiction of the English courts?
The problem is you have no body, no address.
Yeah. You don't. And therefore, what are you going to have to do? Sorry? Seek permission. And that feels terribly inquisitive, isn't it? And old-fashioned. You could be here for a short period of time, and it could be seen as a right. You could not be here, and you can target the UK market like crazy. And you can't be seen as a right. You've got to go through the permissions. And again, I can only say to you again, you'd never invent this in 2018. But in fairness, one could be a bit more critical here, because these rules have been updated in the statute and in procedural rules, both since the turn of the millennium. And nobody has thought to add some kind of provision to deal with the internet. But on the other hand, how can you? Because jurisdiction and service are the same thing in England, common law, there is the sad fact is the Delaware company that's targeting the UK, there is nowhere to serve it. And the answer is blame the rule that service is the same as jurisdiction, because it's very difficult to think of a rule that would deal with the internet. So I think another point, because it's just another reason why the modern law isn't particularly fit for purpose. Next point. So the place of business is very physical, but very easy to obtain if you are here. Okay. Supposing a company does not have a place of business here, but one of its senior officers, the managing director or the chairman, for example, comes to England and is served with a claim form. Whilst he or she is physically in the country. Does that confer jurisdiction and a right over the company? So an officer of the company comes into the country and is served with a claim. Does that, and the company itself does not have a place of business, does that confer jurisdiction over the company as a right? Yes or no? He is served with a claim form that, I'm trying to sue Smith & Co. You're the managing director of Smith & Co., which is, let's say, a taxing company. You come to London for a business meeting. You're not strict to Canberra. You come to this meeting for a wider area, at your hotel. Under your door, which says Harris versus Smith & Co. Okay, so sorry, the answer to the question is no. Is it going to name a company? Is that enough to take jurisdiction of the company or not? What do you think is the answer if you don't know? Absolutely right. It is not the answer, and there's some authority for that. If you look at page 100, that doesn't sound right to me. 110. Apologies, I've written that on reference there. 100. You'll see in footnote 26, and if you read up, that this proposition has been established a couple of times in a case called the Theodolus, which is 3 lines up from the bottom of page 110, which, if you follow that down, is 1977, and reaffirmed more recently, actually, in a case called SFL International in 2011 by the Court of Appeals. They're both in footnote 26 at the bottom of that page, and they both reaffirm the same proposition that service on managing director or senior officer doesn't enable you to take jurisdiction over the company. I mean, the way of thinking of it is, if you're suing the company, it's the company that has to have the place of business. Of course, you're right. If you're suing the managing director personally, that would be enough because presence is already there. But not if you're suing the company. So lastly for today, we need to look at this column, indirect service, through an agent or subsidiary. 2 examples. The first example, which is a very simple example, is the example of employing an agent in this country. And if you stay on page 110 and look at footnote 25, you'll see reference to a case called Litauer. Footnote 25 on page 110. And one of the requirements, according to Litauer, which is then picked up in later cases such as Adams, is that the representative, him or herself, must themselves have a fixed place of business in England. So what happened there was, what was decided in that case is, if you have an agent who basically travels around the world trying to generate it, you've got let's say a Delaware company, and it pays an agent who travels around the world trying to get business for that Delaware company, so it spends some time in London, but it also goes all over the world for it. The court said in Litauer, that isn't enough to establish indirect presence of the company, because the agent themselves must do business in England for more than a minimal period of time. The agent themselves must do business for more than a minimal period of time. And there are a couple of more examples which I won't take you through on the top of page 115, which I'll just refer you to. A case of Sackling Corporation, and a case called Okura, in the first paragraph of 115, which stands for the same proposition. But what I do want to take you through to finish today is the case of subsidiaries. Now, and I want to go back to our friend, the Adams case, Adams and Pip Industry case, on page 115, but really over the page on 116. The funny thing about this case is it's not a jurisdiction case at all. It's a case about enforcement of foreign judgments. But as you'll see next term, the same principle applies in reverse. So in this case, it was about an English company and whether it indirectly did business in the US. So the other way around. But the court says that the law is the same for the other way around about overseas companies and whether they are indirectly present in England for jurisdiction purposes. And this is all about subsidiaries. We've already talked about subsidiaries. You're going to get nowhere. You're going to get absolutely nowhere if you have a parent company from Delaware and a subsidiary in England. You're going to get absolutely nowhere in trying to sue the parent company just by serving the claim form in England and saying, "Yaha, you've got a subsidiary." That's never going to work because it's a separate company. But it will work if you can show that the subsidiary is, in fact, practice so under the control of the parent that it effectively transacts the parent's work for it in England. So although it's formally separate, in practice it is under the control of the parent and doing work and generating work for the parent. Because at that point, the subsidiary becomes pretty much indistinguishable from an agent. It's helping the parent to generate business. Unfortunately, this is the first of many other, well, we already saw one earlier, good old common law principles where it's easier to state the principle than to apply it because the court refuses to lay down a fixed test of when a foreign company is indirectly present through a subsidiary. All it says is it's impossible to have a fixed test, but we can tell you a number of things that are relevant to deciding whether a foreign company is indirectly present in England through a subsidiary. Remembering that the overarching test is that in paragraph 1, little 2 that I've already shown you of the top paragraph on page 116 of whether the company has for more than a minimal period of time been carrying an overseas company has for more than a minimal period of time been carrying on the overseas company's business in the other country. Okay, so is there a subsidiary that's been carrying on the parent's business for more than a minimal period? How do you tell? Well, if you have a look at subparagraph 3, which is the important one, but also the frustrating one, Lord Justice Slade says, in particular, but without prejudice to the generality of the foregoing, the following questions are likely to be relevant. In other words, what he says is, and actually if you go ahead to the bottom of that page, it's probably easier to read that first. He says that the list that we're about to look at is not exhaustive, and the answer to none of them is necessarily conclusive. There are a whole lot of ingredients to throw into the pot, weigh them all up, somewhat impressionistically, and come to the conclusion whether the subsidiary is sufficiently controlled by the parent, that the parent itself is basically doing its business through the subsidiary. Let's have a look at some of them, because some of them are more surprising than others, and some of them are obvious. But paragraph 3, whether the place of business of the representative or subsidiary was originally inquired to do the work of the parent. So how did there come to be an office in England? Was it originally acquired to do the Delaware company's business in England, or at least partly, as a place that the Delaware company could also, when it came to London, do its business from, even though there's a subsidiary or agent in England as well? B, and very, very importantly, does the parent company, or the foreign company, make a contribution to the upkeep of the premises that are in England? The foreign company, but does it pay towards the rent of the English office of the subsidiary or agent? Even things like, does it pay some of the electricity bills or the gas bills? company council tax bills. Does it pay its share for the office? Maybe all of it, but even if it pays some of the bills of the English agent or subsidiary, those are indications that actually maybe it is a separate company, but maybe it's actually intending to have the benefit of that London office, at least partially for itself. Does it pay any of the staff? Does it make a contribution to the salaries of the staff in London, if not in the English office? All kinds of things like that. E, I think, is 3E is incredibly important. How much control does the foreign company exercise over the representative's day-to-day life? How much say does the parent have over what the subsidiary does, or what the agent does? How much control do they have over them? And of course, if you're talking about an agent, some agents will work exclusively for one foreign company. Others may work for lots of companies and be entirely free to set their own hours and say, actually, I don't want any work from you, Delaware company, this week, thank you very much. The more control the company has over the agent or subsidiary, the more likely it is that the parent will be, or foreign company will be deemed to be indirectly present. G is one that I've seen used a lot, and it really catches people out. Stationery. Careless use of stationery costs money. I have no idea how often this is relied upon in litigation. Oh, we've got a completely separate that office in England, completely separate from our Delaware company. It's a subsidiary or it's an agent. Nothing to do with it. Hang on a minute. That English subsidiary, on the letterhead, it's also got the details of the name of the English parent company, or at least you can pick up that stationery. You're giving it out, or people in your office are, maybe carelessly, but are using the stationery of the foreign company with its letterhead. Or you're giving out pens. Pens seem very innocent, but everyone likes having a few pens and fancy bits of stationery. But if you at your office in London are making available the stationery of a Delaware company, you are giving the impression to the outside world that the Delaware company is doing business in England, and that risks sucking the Delaware company indirectly into the English courts through indirect presence. Don't be tempted to show off your connections with a foreign big corporation unless you've really thought that the benefits outweigh the downside, that you might be sucking that company into the jurisdiction of the English courts indirectly. And H mentions, I've already mentioned that, does the agent or subsidiary work for a stream of different people, or does it work pretty much solely for the foreign company? It's pretty much solely there. It's suggesting indirect presence. All of these factors are relevant and conscious of where we are, but as it were, I've started as I finished. And as you can see at the bottom of that page,